2,000 years ago, there was no Vatican, no Sistine Chapel, no conclave, no white smoke. None of the institutions we've spent this entire channel exploring. There was just a small, persecuted religious movement, and one man among its earliest leaders who would eventually become the reference point for an office that still exists today. This video is about how the papacy actually began. Not the legend, but what history and early church tradition actually tell us, and how a role that started as something quite different gradually became the institution we recognize now. Welcome to Pope Pulse. We've spent a lot of time on this channel covering how popes are elected today. This video, and several more like it coming up, look further back to where this whole story actually starts. According to the New Testament, Peter was a Galilean fisherman, originally named Simon, who became one of the earliest and most prominent followers of Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospels describe Jesus giving him the name Peter, from the Greek word for rock, along with a statement widely interpreted within Catholic tradition as establishing a special, foundational leadership role for him among the apostles. Catholic tradition holds that Peter eventually traveled to Rome, then the capital of the Roman Empire and the center of a growing early Christian community, and that he served as a leader of the Christian community there before being martyred, traditionally understood to have been crucified, during a wave of persecution under the Roman Emperor Nero, generally dated to around the year 64 or 65. It's worth being clear about something historians generally acknowledge. The New Testament itself does not describe Peter holding a formal title equivalent to pope, nor does it describe a formal, structured office resembling the papacy as it exists today. What it does establish, in the eyes of Catholic tradition, is Peter's distinctive leadership role among the apostles and his direct connection to the Christian community in Rome specifically, the foundation on which everything discussed in this video eventually built. In the earliest decades of Christianity, leadership structures within local Christian communities were considerably less formalized than what developed later. Local communities, including the one in Rome, were generally led by figures described in early Christian writing as elders or overseers, terms that eventually evolved into the more formal role of bishop as church structure developed further. Early Christian writers, particularly from the late 1st and 2nd centuries, began specifically identifying a continuous line of leadership in the Roman Christian community traced back to Peter, treating him as the first in a succession of leaders of that community. Effectively, the first bishop of Rome, even though that exact formal title likely wasn't used during his own lifetime in the way it came to be understood later. This concept, generally called apostolic succession, became theologically significant specifically because it established an unbroken chain of authority reaching back to an apostle personally chosen by Jesus. For the Bishop of Rome specifically, this connection to Peter became the theological foundation for claims to a special, elevated role among all other bishops across the wider Christian world, a claim that would develop and strengthen considerably over the following centuries, but which traces its theological roots to this early period. It's worth pausing on a natural question. Why did leadership within the wider early Christian church end up concentrating around the Bishop of Rome specifically, rather than some other city with an early Christian community? Several factors converged. Rome was the political and administrative capital of the entire empire, giving whoever led its Christian community a certain natural prominence simply by association with the empire's most significant city. The tradition of both Peter and Paul, another hugely significant early apostle, having been martyred in Rome specifically gave the city's Christian community a uniquely strong claim to apostolic authority, compared to communities that couldn't point to comparable direct connections to Jesus' original inner circle of apostles. Rome's Christian community was also, from an early period, relatively large and reasonably well-resourced compared to many other early Christian centers, allowing it to play an outsized practical role in coordinating with, and sometimes assisting, other Christian communities facing persecution or hardship elsewhere in the empire. Over the following few centuries, this combination of symbolic, political, and practical factors gradually reinforced the Bishop of Rome's uniquely elevated status, well beyond what any purely administrative logic alone would have produced. The kind of centralized authority we associate with the modern papacy didn't emerge all at once. It developed gradually and unevenly over several centuries, often in response to specific theological disputes or political crises that created a practical need for some kind of final, authoritative voice. Early bishops of Rome gradually became recognized reference points in resolving theological disputes among different Christian communities, precisely because of their claimed connection to Peter's authority. This role expanded considerably following the Roman Emperor Constantine's legalization of Christianity in the early 4th century, and even more so after Christianity became the empire's officially favored religion later that same century, since Christian leadership more broadly gained substantially more political significance and visibility once it was no longer an outlawed, persecuted faith operating largely underground. As the Western Roman Empire itself gradually declined and eventually collapsed in the late 5th century, the Bishop of Rome increasingly stepped into a broader leadership role within Western Europe generally, partly by simple necessity, since existing Roman imperial political structures that had previously provided regional stability and governance were disappearing. This period, more than any single earlier moment, cemented the Bishop of Rome's unique, elevated position, no longer simply a respected voice among many bishops, but increasingly the central, authoritative figure specifically within Western Christianity. The word pope itself comes from the Latin papa, essentially meaning father, and it wasn't originally exclusive to the Bishop of Rome at all. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, this term was used more broadly as a term of respect for various bishops across different regions, not specifically reserved for Rome's bishop alone. Over time, particularly by around the 6th century in the Western Church specifically, usage gradually narrowed, and the term increasingly became specifically associated with the Bishop of Rome, eventually becoming his exclusive formal title within the Western Christian tradition, while other regions, particularly within Eastern Christianity, continued somewhat different naming conventions and organizational structures that developed along a genuinely separate path. This gradual linguistic narrowing mirrors the broader institutional story we've been describing throughout this video. Not a single dramatic founding moment establishing the papacy in one stroke, but a slow, multi-century process of a particular leadership role becoming increasingly formalized, increasingly centralized, and increasingly distinct from other Christian leadership positions across the wider ancient world. Understanding this gradual, centuries-long formation actually helps explain quite a lot about the modern papacy we've spent so much time covering elsewhere on this channel. The heavy emphasis on continuity, tradition, and careful, deliberate procedure that defines everything from conclave rules to papal name choices makes considerably more sense once you understand that the office itself emerged through exactly that same kind of gradual, careful, tradition-conscious process, rather than through some single dramatic founding event with a clean, simple origin story. The papacy's authority has always rested heavily on the claim of unbroken continuity stretching back to Peter, which is precisely why so much of what the modern church does around papal transitions, which we've covered extensively elsewhere in this series, focuses so heavily on preserving and demonstrating that same sense of careful, unbroken continuity generation after generation. It also helps explain why Catholic tradition places such theological weight on the specific, unbroken line of individual popes, one after another all the way back to Peter, a lineage the Church takes very seriously, precisely because that continuous chain is understood as the entire theological foundation the office's authority ultimately rests upon. So that's the real origin story. Not a single founding moment, but a gradual, multi-century process, beginning with a Galilean fisherman's distinctive leadership role among the earliest followers of Jesus, developing through several centuries of theological reasoning and genuine historical circumstance, and eventually producing the office we've spent so much of this channel exploring in its fully modern form. If you're interested in going even further back into early church history, let me know in the comments what you'd like covered next. We've got a lot more ground to explore in this pillar, from the early persecutions, to the councils that shaped Christian doctrine, to the medieval church's dramatic rise in political power. Subscribe to Pope Pulse so you don't miss what's coming next.